Hello and welcome to the 1916 Company Podcast. I'm Tim Masso here with Armand Johnston. Remember, guys, this is an interactive experience, so if you have an idea, question, or query for the podcast, send it to podcasts at the1916company.com. Armand, today's topic is yours, so I'm going to let you introduce that.
All right, so we are picking from the $5,000, $50,000, and $500,000 pricing categories when it comes to watches. Now, I think we both picked two pieces each. If you don't mind, I'm going to start off with a true classic and relatively low-hanging fruit, honestly, I think in the collecting world, and I think especially in the $5,000 range, and that is going to be the Omega Seamaster Diver 300. It's kind of just one of those classic pieces that is always available for honestly sub $5,000, but within the $5,000 range, within striking distance of $5,000. And whether you're getting this an original 90s piece, one of the ceramic bezel no wave dials, which is actually my personal favorite, or one of the new ceramic dials with the laser etched wave, you're getting an amazing piece. You're getting Omega reliability, you're getting a watch with a date, you're getting good lume, easy legibility, and easy daily wearability. So this one is just kind of the $5,000 pick to me.
That's a really cool idea, and I like starting off with an Omega because you get great value. I think you get quality that's pretty much as good as any mass-produced watch. Now, they do have some handmade pieces, but if you're going to buy something in the mainstream that's mass-produced, I think Omega gets you much closer to something along the lines of like a series production JLC or IWC or Zenith than something like a Longines or a Tag Heuer. I think Omega gives you a lot of value too because there's such variety. The Diver 300 meter, people think of obviously the James Bond, the 25, 30, 180, but I just did a show on Monday about how much I was inspired to get into the watch hobby by the iridescent electric blue dial, the 225580.
I watched that while I was working out, actually, and I
that.
loved your nuclear reactor glow photo that you used in that.
And I'll be totally honest, that does express that dial better than any photo Omega ever took of the watch. So you can go with that. You can go with one of the broadsword hands designs. You can go with the original James Bond hands. There's more modern models that have ceramic dials, special editions, and I think a lot of these still register solidly under $5,000.
Yeah, I was actually going to say the broad arrow or the broadsword handset is really cool. I also really like the GMTs, like the Great White GMT, and still, I think under $5,000 or within striking distance, the Apnea. Apnea is such a fun, weird, cool complication that I just absolutely adore. It is a free diving countdown timer, which is just super cool.
And very closely associated with Jacques Mayol. It was actually his vision for an Omega watch, which is a really neat idea because if you think about it, a watch that is made for a super specific application that frankly doesn't have a lot of commercial penetration, that's love when a brand does something like that with a person who's that special, because I don't think you expect every kid in America to identify with Jacques Mayol and freediving with dolphins.
And it lives in this world of obscurity now where you see that on somebody's wrist and you think, oh my gosh, what else do they have in their collection? Because it is so out of left field. I think few people even would recognize the term apnea directly from us just talking about it.
I've only had this watch occasionally in the past, and just to confirm, I'm looking at the prices for these, and they are solidly all below $5,000. For me, I think the most interesting is the black dial. A lot of people, though, would say that the monotone look and the stainless steel-like silver dial has a lot of appeal. I think the black's a little bit more dramatic just because of the way it contrasts with the Apnea disc itself, which transitions from black to red on that one and from silver to red on the silver dial. It is the Diver 300 meter case. It's a unique movement that you'll only find in this application, and it's got a very cool metal bezel insert that's not anodized. It's got numbers but no anodization, which makes the watch read as a little bit less sequestered and constrained than some of the others in the series. Really neat piece.
What is your first $5,000 price point timepiece?
So I don't want to start with Omega 2 because you just did. So I'm going to go with a watch that came out in 2019, and I always admired this an awful lot. From Ball, we have the Engineer Hydrocarbon Original. Now, I'm not necessarily a fan of all fossil fuel powered watches, but this is a fascinating one because it offers a ton of functionality in a 40 millimeter case. And I think a lot of folks say, well, I think Ball's kind of interesting, but the watches are all huge. This one isn't. So the hydrocarbon, if you're wondering where this comes from, Ball is a railroad themed watch company. And although it makes its watches in Switzerland, it is American owned and directed. So they consider the USA to be their domestic market, which is a little bit unusual. And of course, Webster Ball in the 1890s was called upon by the US railroad industry to create standards for railroad watches. And so he created standards that were so exacting. As far as I know, only one European manufacturer even tried to build a watch to the standards, and that was Vacheron, which made a beautiful watch, but it wasn't conventionally serviceable by like American watchmakers.
Which piece was that?
The Vacheron?
Yes.
It was a pocket watch. It was pre-reference number. It was the Vacheron Ball model, because Ball actually, it says like Ball on the bridges because Ball was responsible for certifying it as railroad grade when it came to America. So that was a really cool piece. But now Ball today, look, I'm not a fighter pilot. I'm not a race car driver. I don't participate in any extreme sports, but I rode the train every day for 4 years going into New York City. So I can relate to trains. And this is Engineer Hydrocarbon shoveling coal into the train, like, you know, like Casey Jones and his firemen. And actually, that's an unfortunate story that happened to lead to the creation of the railroad standards. But this watch is a dive watch, actually, and it's 40 millimeters in diameter, and it's just loaded with really, really cool features. So first, it's a chronometer, which is always a guarantee of a bare minimum of quality. When you've got a chronometer, you've got a movement with a $300 balance. You've got a Niverox 1 hairspring, the best available. It's COSC certified. It's just in basic ETA caliber with a day and a date, but it's the highest grade available. It's 80,000 ampere per meter or Milgauss anti-magnetic. It's got 30 tritium tracers, so it's got radioactive luminescence, which you can't find on anything else above like Luminox grade these days. It's very difficult to find self-activating lume. It is shock resistant to 7,500 G because it's got the spring lock system. And it's also got spring seal, which is a regulator anti-shock system. So not only will it continue to keep good time and not get broken by shock, but the regulator will not be moved by shock, which is great because it won't permanently change the timing of the watch. It's got their unique crown guard, which is actually a patented design. And the first time you see this thing, you're like, oh, that must be like a chintzy piece of junk. It's this tiny little flappy piece, but it's not. You put it in your hand and you're impressed by how solidly it's made. It's got a lovely sapphire capped bezel, which is always a treat because that's something I associate with more expensive watches than this. And the price of this whole thing, it's just $3,349 new. You could probably find one used for less than that. It's just a really awesome little diver. And yeah, shock resistant, water resistant, anti-magnetic to the point of being like an engineer's watch, tritium lit, full of patented innovations with a chronometer movement. How much better does life get?
You know, your comment about the crown guard is absolutely spot on. I remember reading about, and just, you know, watching these pieces on people's wrists, and it wasn't until I handled it in person that I actually felt positively about the crown guard, because it is significant. It's not a chintzy piece of metal. It's not something like, and I'm not calling the brand out, it's not something like the little screw-on Graham type of
that ridiculous
crown cover
thing
or anything like that. It is significant. It's finished well. It fits well. It feels like a positive lock when you latch it, and it's actually it's a spring-loaded ball bearing, or
yeah, it's a spring-loaded pin snap, and then it's a trigger release, and the thing has an incredible amount of solidity for such a small part. It's only about the size of a Tic Tac, and it makes a difference. Like if you have, I don't know, like a Tag Heuer with a crown guard, and you smash the crown perpendicular to something, crown guard, a shouldered crown guard's not going to protect you against that. This is like Panerai levels of crown protection, but without the bulk.
I totally agree, and it's such a fun little addition that I think unless you handle it in person, you may think is kitschy or you may think is a little bit too much, but until you feel that it doesn't really wobble on the watch, it's significant. It's cool. You'll handling this in person will make one like it.
Yeah, this is a watch that I think gives you the most features and patented innovations for under $5,000, and it's a great little diver, and it's almost like a baby 50 fathoms in terms of how it looks. So that's my first sub $5,000 watch. How about you? What is your second?
My second is going to be a bit potentially controversial, actually, because it is a Hublot, and this is a Hublot that I have personally owned, and it's one of the watches that I regret trading. And this is in a lot of its forms, any form, honestly, the Hublot Super B Chronograph. This is and please correct me if I'm wrong, this is a Dubois Dupree module chronograph movement. It is a just really kind of classic wearable size Hublot sitting right at about 42 millimeters, wears closer to a 40 due to the case design. It does have an integrated style rubber strap. Now, what's interesting about this is that these were produced for a few years and seemingly out of a hodgepodge of parts. It seemed during the production of the Super B, Hublot had a pile of parts that all fit together, and they just kind of grabbed from it seemingly at random, to the point where towards the end of this watch's production, you would get pieces with an Arabic dial with a rubber bezel. You'd get an Arabic dial with a steel bezel, maybe a rose bezel. Maybe you would get a Roman numeral dial. Maybe you would get just a stick dial. And seemingly the references didn't always directly correspond to exactly the watch that you had. So towards the end of these production, it kind of got fun and not as T's crossed and I's dotted as we think of in the Swiss watch industry, which generally is something that we don't really like. But for some reason, this watch is just represents fun to me, represents a really good era of wearable Hublot. And it's something you can swim with. It's got a little bit of shock resistance, and it doesn't really scream, look at me, I'm a Hublot. And I really, really love this piece. I always encourage people to look at this when you have a reasonable sized wrist and you're looking for something that's a little bit different in the, I would call this anywhere $3,500 to $6,000 price range.
Yeah, a couple things there. Now, Biver's first year running Hublot was 2004, which is when the Super B came out. And for me, this is a perfect modern take on the original 80s aesthetic of Hublot. It was 2005 when the Big Bang came out, and I think a lot of people would sort of say it went off the rails. But the Super B is nicely sized. It's 42. It actually wears smaller than that. Can you imagine that? An Hublot that wears smaller than its rated size? There are two different versions. There's one that's a flyback chronograph. It's a modular chronograph, so it's got an ETA base, and then, like you said, it's got a Dubois de Praz module on the top. And the flyback makes this a really handy little watch. It's water resistant, it's loomed, it's sporty, it's not too big, you can wear it full time. It's not going to raise eyebrows the way, I don't know, a 48 millimeter King Power would. By the way, what is the mental state of the person who came up with the name of that watch? Well, what should we call it? Should we call it the Emperor Explosion Awesome? The Volcano Commandment Titan Imperator?
Some of the names are really something. Honestly, even Super B is a little bit kitschy, isn't it?
I mean, at least it's super the letter B. It's not Super B like an old muscle car.
Right.
But I think that's probably what they had in mind. I like that watch a lot. And actually, I've had Ariel Adams of A Blog to Watch tell me, like, if you guys ever get the Super B, give me a call. And I guess we just don't have it that often. It's not a common watch in its flyback form.
And they do not have any parts left for this piece. So that was actually part of my decision to sell it was, I couldn't replace the pushers. I couldn't replace the crown. I had an extra strap, but Hublot did not have another strap.
You see, that's why eventually you've got to just go small watchmakers who are specialists in reusing and repairing things and go to full custom for straps, because somebody out there can make that strap. If you can make a custom strap for a Richard Mille, you can make a custom strap for a Super B. And there's definitely a custom RM strap scene. So, unfortunately, that's often the way it is. Like, I saw an Arnold & Son recently that was made back when British Masters owned the brand. And Arnold & Son today, which is owned by Le Jeu Perret and has been since 2012, they said, oh, we're sorry, we can't do anything with that watch. It's from before we owned the brand, and it uses a manufacture movement by Christophe Claret, which is now bankrupt. I'm like, oh, well, okay. So much for taking care of any watch ever. That's the great thing about Patek Philippe. Amid the raft of changes we saw this year, they mentioned that every watch they've ever made, they're committed to supplying every single part forever.
And that is remarkable, because I think if you go to the Patek Antique Works or the vintage shop where there's a total of, I want to say, 4 watchmakers who are all have an oil lamp on their desk, all have hand tools, all have stacks of paper, 8 feet tall, that are original drawings of original reference pieces. I think sometimes they regret that statement to the point where, you can get anything with the name Patek Philippe fixed by the brand directly, and they will remanufacture, refinish, retool apart entirely from the ground up for you. You will absolutely pay for it, but the work is brilliant, and it's just remarkable to see true artisans, true watchmakers, and I mean watchmakers, not watch assemblers, work at that level for something that was made maybe it was 60 years ago, maybe it was 100 years ago, and their commitment is second to none. It's amazing. And then you do hear horror stories about not being able to get certain pieces fixed from the brands that are on the dial, and it's you scratch your head.
Yeah, I've seen some orphaned brands that were owned by, like Martin Braun, that were owned by Watchland, which is the larger Franck Muller empire. They weren't able to get parts, even though the company that made it still exists. It doesn't make the brand anymore, but it still exists. So big shout out to Patek Philippe then, but I think we're a bit above our price point. We're talking about $5,000 watches, and my second $5,000 choice is a watch that was made for a brief period from 1998, and that is the Omega de Ville Prestige Jump Hour, and you can find these for right about $5,000 on a strap. What's not to like? Tonneau case, salmon dial, jumping hour, automatic base, Omega, which will service all of its watches and take care of you. And right around $5,000, you get something that people are going to see and think, is it Gerald Genta? Is it a Vacheron Saltarello? All of their guesses are going to be more expensive things than this is. And again, it's nuts and bolts Omega architecture from a company that will always stand by its stuff.
It's a tonneau style case. It's very, very cool. This does have a bracelet associated with it, which is a great bracelet too. It's a 7-link bracelet across. It looks great. It looks great with the case. I love this piece. Actually, a good friend and client of mine has one of these, and it's modestly sized. There's nothing bad to say about this. This is a very, very cool, complicated, and just super cool jump hour.
Yeah, and for me, this is a great watch because there is a bracelet. There's also a gold version of the watch. But if you want to get it for $5,000 or less, it's going to have to be steel on a strap, which I think is a great look. I like having a little bit of tonal contrast, a darker strap on a watch like this. So really cool stuff. Everything about it's very positive. I've heard no horror stories, and I almost always hear horror stories about digital jumping time watches mechanically. This has been a no-complaint everyday jump hour from a brand that's always going to be there. So that's my second $5,000 pick. I think now, how many we're doing? We're doing, I think, two per price point.
2 per price point, yeah. One thing about that piece, I love, what would you call that hand, Tim, with the circle on the center? It's almost, what I love about it is when it crosses the jump hour, the hour is framed exactly, perfectly by the circle in the hour hand.
Yeah, I think that this is just a unique hand, and it's rare that a designer or a brand would come up with a unique hand for such a low-volume product because you have to tool up for it. You have to create CAD/CAM drawings. Like, there is work involved and investment to be made. But it is unique to this watch. I've never seen it on any other Omega watch, and that's one of the reasons this is so special. It had a very short production run, maybe 18 months, maybe 24. There are very few of them out there. They don't come to market often, but it's a great looking watch and anyone can wear it. It's one of the few non-round watches that wears true to size. I'd say if you can wear a 36 millimeter round watch, you can wear this. So it's very versatile in that regard too. And I just love it to pieces. It's a stupendous piece. And I think if you're putting together a great 1990s era Omega collection from like that category that we call new vintage, this would be a really neat anchor to the collection that's not just another Moonwatch or Seamaster.
Really, really solid pick. I like that one a lot.
All right, $50,000. Now, believe it or not, most of the watches I want don't even cost this much, so I had to look a little bit, but what'd you come up with?
So, we paid respect to Patek a bit, and I actually have 2 on my list. The first of which is the 5960/1A. This is the annual calendar chronograph in steel on a steel bracelet, and this watch... these are well within the $50,000 price point, and they can be had in maybe as low as the high 30s, depending. I see this piece now. Granted, I am a black dial guy, so I like the steel black dial version. But the watch to have in 5960 is the steel with the white dial and the dark rhodium markers. To me, there's something just elegant, timeless, and sporty about it. You know, you have a pairing of complications, a calendar and a chrono, which is very Patek, of course. Now, a step further, it's an annual calendar. So a Patek invented complication, you know, mixed with the very Patek pairing of the chronograph on top of that. I think you have an extremely clean 12-hour chronograph totalizer at the 6 o'clock. You have what can be a running seconds with a vertical clutch column wheel chronograph in this piece. You have a power reserve. Everything is right there. It's legible. Now, the one downside is a lack of water resistance, which I think is what keeps people from viewing this as a sportier watch, that and the full high polish. Now, I absolutely view this as a Patek sport watch because it is a sport complication. It is a chronograph. It is in a steel case. It is on a bracelet. And it wears just remarkably well. It doesn't feel too thick due to the scalloping of the bezel. The movement itself is finished to the standard of Patek, which we all understand the standard of the Patek Philippe seal. It's outrageous. It's beautiful. And there's just something that is vintage inspired in the numerals. There's vintage inspired in the sportiness, and I don't have enough good things to say about the 5961A.
You know, these days, Patek is saying that its 30-meter watches are authentically 30 meters. And while this watch has gone out of production, the 5960 is still with us. So I'm going to bet that if the current 5960 is a true 30 meters, then so is this. Nothing physically changed about the watches, all the watches this year, when they went to that 30 meters is a real 30 type standard. Now, obviously, a screw-down crown Nautilus has more real-world water resistance than a push-down crown 5960. But if Patek is going to bat for people who are actually swimming with these things at 30 meters with a push-down crown, I've got to assume that, like the FP Journe sports watches that are also 30 meters, there is a little bit of a margin of safety here, and that this could probably go in the water, provided it's recently passed water test.
I assume that accidental submersion is going to be fine on most modern watches. You know, if you're at a party and you get knocked into a pool or something like that, which, you know, I mean, has only happened to me maybe once in my life, and it was a very specific circumstance, but I have to assume accidental submersion is fine unless you're wearing something like a minute repeater or something vintage.
Yeah, and also this is a very interesting piece if it's got the black dial, which came out in 2017 when it was made for all of a hot minute. Now this is going to be, we're stretching our definitions here. You could be around 50,000, but you could also be between 50,000 and our next bracket, which is 500. So if you look at these things selling for, let's say, $85,000 to $90,000, theoretically we're still in that bracket between 50 and 500,000. The black dial one for me is definitely the one to get for rarity, for the fact that I love dark dials. It was made from, I don't know, maybe 8 months.
Yeah, I was going to say a 9-month production period, but no, you're probably
9.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the most because it was not made for a full model year. So here you've got this full bracelet steel Patek Philippe complicated sports watch. What do you think the future is going to think about this? I think they're going to think everyone needs one.
I completely agree. You know, to me, this is the better version of the 5905. The 5905 is the same complication, chrono annual calendar, just in a slightly larger case with a different pusher profile, different profile in general. I think the 5960 in general, let alone the steel piece, is going to be extremely fondly looked at in a very short time.
So for my $50,000 class watch, I have to admit I needed to search a little bit because I'm dipping my toe back into the world of Jaeger-LeCoultre. And the 2015 Duometre UTT with chiseled dial was just absolutely awesome, electrifying. A 200-piece 42mm white gold limited edition. It is, as far as I can recall, the only JLC jump hour wristwatch that features, because there are digital chronographs that they've made in the modern era, but in terms of a jumping hour wristwatch, that UTT seems to stand alone. And it's a really special piece because it is one of the few travel time watches that you can set to the minute on its secondary time zone. So not only do you have a very cool jumping hour display for your reference time, but you've got the ability to offset 45, 30, 15 minutes. And those kind of super fine universal dual time watches are uncommon. And unlike some awkwardly designed watches that just include two movements in one case, this is all one movement with two separate mainspring barrels driving a combination of the time and complications and the regulator separately. The use of a chiseled dial really caught my eye because the hand-hammered dial, it's never the same twice. And the watch, I always thought it looked like a watch sucking on an orange, so it's got a bit of it's an acquired taste aesthetically. But from a technical standpoint, this was, prior to some of the super complications in Ibris Mechanica, this was the most complicated Duometre to date. And it's an absolutely monster machine. I believe it's also the only Duometre that works at 4 hertz. And caliber 383, beautifully decorated in German silver. You might realize, of course, that the Duometre was redesigned across the range for 2024, but they now feature rhodium-plated brass bridges, which did away with some of the charm of the watch, and it's probably a cost-cutting measure. This is the old-school dual-wing movement in Lange-style German silver, and it's Lange-style finish, which makes it really special.
You know, I was really excited to see the Duometre make it back into the collection, and I hate to be disappointed by things like this, but I was disappointed that it was not a German silver movement because the original Duometre movements are gorgeous, and the German silver just takes finishing in such a rich direction. It's beautiful, and the one thing that stands out are the ratchet wheels on this piece too.
Yeah, like a Grand Sonnerie, it is a wonderful sort of ratchet and spring, almost like an Ouroboros, where they sort of orbit the pawl wheel at center. And they ratchet all the way around as they move in one direction. And because you wind both barrels by turning the crown in different directions, it has that Grand Sonnerie style double barrel Victorin Piguet type of twin train design. And they actually took this from the Heritage Gallery, where they had a minute repeating, I believe, deadbeat second chronometer pocket watch. And again, this was a Victorin Piguet, a Bausch, but JLC finished it and complicated it. And by having two separate drivetrains, you can have two separate functions without one detracting from the other. So, for example, you can have one barrel to run the sonnerie, and then you can have one barrel to run the watch. But what they did here is they had one barrel to run the oscillator and one barrel to run the time and the complications. So despite the fact that it's an energy-intensive, complicated watch, that's got its own barrel. It's got its own drivetrain. It's got its own power source. The balance itself has its own power source, so there's no drawdown of amplitude as, for example, the jump of the hour approaches or the cyclical turn of the little secondary time display changes, because it does have two time displays, one with the jump hour and a minute hand, one with two hands for the hours and the minutes. So it's just a really brilliant system that's endlessly beautiful to my eye, and $50,000 would just about swing that. And I think that's probably the Duometre that I want most. Having owned a Duometre, originally I had the Chronograph, which was the white gold model with the black dial, and I think I paid $37 for that, so I did really well back in 2014. But this is cooler to me because the Chronograph, its function I don't use all that often, whereas traveling and keeping track of far-flung business associates all the time. Very cool piece. And artisanally hand-hammered, one of the coolest JLC dials. Of the 2010s, which I will say, at least on the back half, were a really fallow period for cool JLC watches.
You know, I was just going to say, I have a complicated relationship with modern JLC in general, but the Duometre collection in general, the original Duometre collection, I think really illustrates what JLC is as a company, as the watchmaker's watchmaker, as what collectors perceive them to be. And I think this type of complication, this type of dial layout, this type of finishing just really speaks volumes for the brand.
So now where are you going? Second $50,000 class watch, which we have established is now like 50,000 to 499,000. So it gives you some flexibility.
I am going to another watch that I have a relatively complicated relationship with, actually, and that is the Laurent Ferrier Sport. When I say complicated relationship, I really strongly disliked this watch before I held it in person, before I handled it. And that is the case with quite a few watches to me. But I felt like this one was confused. I felt like this is a round watch with a square bezel with a round dial. I felt that something just felt off with it. And then, I spent some time with it in person. I got to view it, and I really, really, really do like it. My biggest, I would say my biggest complaint with it at first was the bracelet, but the bracelet's finished to an extremely high degree. The case itself is finished to a very high degree, and the movement is beautiful. It has everything that you would expect from Laurent Ferrier. Now, what I will say is this is the more modern feeling movement design of Laurent Ferrier, whereas the bridges are a little bit more squared off, slightly less organic, and you get that kind of dark rhodium finish to it. You still get a really great micro rotor. You still have some nice shapes, some decent finishing, but it is a little bit more on the modern side. But I do really like this watch. It has grown on me like a vine.
I know that feeling, and sometimes watches that are imperfect are the ones that hold our attention, capture our imagination more. I think when something is too easy to like and you can't pick out anything you object to, it's also hard to really love it too. I think the watches that leave us sort of lukewarm, those are like Toyota Camrys, which are perfectly rational choices, and the things that are deeply flawed but also really provocative, like the Alfa Romeo Giulia, which is as likely as any modern car to leave you stranded out of the showroom. That's the kind of car you love in spite of all of its flaws. And I would say the Ferrier Sport is a hell of a lot better than the Giulia. I don't want to impugn the mechanics at all, just to say that it's very much a watch that's trying to catch up with a trend, and they were behind on that trend. It's not finished quite to the level of something like the classic or Gallet Micro Rotor, and they understand that. And maybe it's a little bit too large, but there's also a lot that's right. And the more you look at some high-end brands that kind of aimed and missed at this segment, like the Hector from Languntaina or the C in the Continuum from Romain Gaultier, this is still a respectable watch that does not embarrass its maker and lives up to most of the promise set by previous models. It's still very well finished. It's still very accomplished mechanically, and it has both meaningful lume and meaningful water resistance, which I consider mandatory in the sports watch segment, whereas some of those others don't. So this watch, to me, it's a win in a very contested field. It may not be best in class, but it's definitely a contender.
There's a few things that just don't give me pause, but make me question things. For example, an onion crown on something like this, and I would absolutely call it an onion crown, based off of the shape, based off of the design. It was an interesting choice. It really was. I think the cross section of the dial with the framed date, framed in ink transfer alone, was a very interesting choice as well. It has such a, for lack of a better descriptor, 70s feel to it. I would even put this Glashütte Senator 70s adjacent, almost, due to the kind of square roundness of the watch. But there's just something off about it, and that's what makes it right to me.
That's cool. Well, I like that because we've both experienced this watch. We've seen it in person. So you know for sure that you like this piece, because I think the practice is in the hand. And I think at the end of the day, you don't know until you wear a watch, which is why, plug in the company here, we have a 7-day no questions asked return policy, because if you buy something sight unseen, you should be able to try it first. I'm fortunate that I have tried my choice for the second $50,000 watch, which is the 2015 Zenith Academy Georges Favre. Now, I do not like rose gold and yellow gold watches, and I think that kind of gold doesn't work well in large scale, and yet this watch is a 45mm rose gold watch. But what I love about it is that it has one of the most beautiful implementations of a fusee and chain I've seen on caliber 4810, which was only ever used by this model, which is properly sized to fit the big case, which is finished at a level we know Zenith can achieve, but it very rarely applies to its modern watches. And it's got a 575-piece Fusee chain constant force device, turning an El Primero escapement that does not include a chronograph. And had I not seen this watch in person and tried it firsthand, I would not know, first, that I can wear it and that it fits, and second, that it absolutely succeeds. This watch is a triumph. This is the crowning glory of the Jean-Frédéric Dufour era at Zenith. The audition, a brief audition, only about 5 years he ran the company, but that got him his job as Director General at Rolex. And I think as a 5-year sample of work, it's probably the best performance by any CEO at any watch brand, certainly in the LVMH family tree, and maybe at any watch brand ever. For just 5 years, this guy was like the Sandy Koufax of watch executives, just based on the output each one of those 5 years. And this was the best. He put together a Hall of Fame career and a Rolex resume in basically 5 years running Zenith. And this was the crowning glory.
You know, this piece is extremely interesting. For one thing, the two massive bridges that hold the chain mechanism, the chain of Fusee, they're extremely highly finished. They're gorgeous. And it's also designed in such a way for symmetry. For an asymmetrical dial, the chain of Fusee setup is symmetrical on the dial, on the watch itself. So when you're looking down the barrel straight at it, it is very aesthetically pleasing. You know, you do have a sub-seconds, you do have a power reserve, and you do have an entire, I would call it a third of the dial open worked. And now Zenith is no stranger to open work, but they are a stranger to open work of this finishing level. And this is absolutely outrageous. Really fun pick.
It's got a cool detail with the 575-piece chain. It has some elevated links, and the elevated links at the end of the chain eventually slot into a little stopworks that sits on the barrel and fusee assembly. So it's got a stopworks to prevent it from being overwound and also to stop it before it starts to underperform and lose time. And this is a movement that was built to perform. It's unique. It is beautifully made and hand regulated and exclusive to this application with incredible dial side depth. Like you said, you look into this dial, not at it. And it was just a moment in time. 150 years, 150-piece limited edition. Very, very, very cool. And even at its size, even in rose gold, I would love to own this.
This is something that I think a lot of people would overlook from a brand like Zenith too. You know, this is, you know, high horological complication. This is high horological finishing. This is something that, you know, you don't expect from the Chronograph company. You know what I mean? They're the El Primero company. This is the, you know, for lack of a better phrase, they're a little bit scrappy. They're a little bit more known for one watch than some other brands.
I would say they're stuck in an uncomfortable middle position between Tag Heuer and Hublot in the LVMH watch group. Remember, Bulgari and Louis Vuitton watches operate autonomously. So LVMH watch group is Tag, it's Zenith, and it's Hublot. And unfortunately, they get stuck in sort of a rut between the two, where they have some hand-me-down elements from Hublot and some hand-me-up elements from Tag Heuer, and so they struggle with their identity, even though by all rights they should be the most impressive brand of the three, certainly with their history and capability. This watch embodies all of that, and it looks like no Tag, and it looks like no Hublot, and it's one of the few fusee and chain watches you'll find that was actually a certified chronometer, because most watches that use, you know, horlogerie, they just want to talk about fine finish and history. They don't actually want to put up or shut up, and this thing did, which I love. So I would absolutely buy this. I wish they would reissue it in white gold, but I can't complain. If I had this thing, I would smile every day.
Now, you don't know what retail on this was originally, do you?
No, but I know that they sell for between 65 and 70. I bet you could bargain that down to 60 today, full box papers, all that stuff. So I could look it up, but given that it's been off the market for most of a decade, I just go by the used price.
Kind of irrelevant at this point almost.
Yeah. I think it's only relevant for someone selling one used who's trying to make it look like a real deal. So, okay. Now comes the heavy artillery. And I got to admit, I was at almost a loss to find the watch I want
too.
for $500,000? Because you struggle at that point. There are a lot of watches that cost $500,000, but I don't think some Philippe Dufour three-hand watch or the Chronomètre Contemporain from Régepi, it doesn't feel to me like a $500,000 watch. It feels like I'm paying for some sort of history or mythos or hype or market momentum. I would rather get $500,000 worth of watch that's really on no one's radar, which is hard to find because they're almost all hype watches.
You know, and you said that very well, because I actually found they were mostly Pateks. And that kind of blew me away. Well, which leads me to my first choice, which is the Patek 5959, which is the Patek's first in-house chronograph, which just happens to be a 33 millimeter split second. Specifically, the 5959P in with the black dial. I think it is a perfect watch. There are many perfect watches in this world, thankfully, and this is really, probably one of the top 10 perfect watches to me.
Yeah, it's hard to fault, and it's an awesome piece if you're okay with the size.
I think the size actually adds to it. I think being that it's an unapologetically vintage-inspired timepiece, and this came out in, 2001?
We're talking about the 59, 2005.
2005, excuse me. Okay. So extremely vintage inspired for the time that it came out. You're talking 2005 is the time of the Super Avenger. I think we talked about very recently on a different podcast, but a 33 millimeter ultra high complication split second chronograph in 2005, I think really speaks volumes. And I think the size does it a service, honestly, because it becomes a Patek collector's timepiece. It's not the watch that everybody's chasing after. It's extremely rare in its own right, and it's something that I think is just buried in collections.
It's a super cool piece. Officer's case, split second, Patek Philippe's first ever in-house chronograph caliber too. Doesn't get enough credit for that. Because of the lugs, which are, if you need a mental picture of an officer's watch, think of the way the lugs work on a Breguet. It's just like that. So it has a bigger presence on the wrist. I think it's the kind of thing that works best with a dark dial, because if it's got a light dial, it winds up looking dainty. Whereas if it's got a dark dial, it's masculine, but it's masculine in a vintage paradigm. The kind of thing that a really dashing 1930s gentleman would have worn. You'll look at, Gianni Agnelli, and he wears all these tiny little watches, but he makes them look so cool. I can imagine a watch like this on his wrist.
These watches I feel like are something that are more for the wearer than the person across the table from them. And I think that adds to the air of coolness to them. I think it adds to the air of collectability, and I think it just adds to the watch overall in the sense of, if you're wearing one of these, it is for you.
Yeah, super cool watch. And like I always say, the man makes the watch, not the other way around. So definitely. Okay, so for me, this is really hard. So a standard Greubel Forsey double tourbillon 30 degree, new or used, it should not cost you $500,000. They're easy to find out there in the $200,000 and $300,000 range. And that's not a verdict on Greubel Forsey. It's just a fact most watches depreciate when they're used. So the one I always adored was the one I've never seen, which is the Double Tourbillon Secret. This is a watch that was a Robert Greubel idea. He's the silent man at Greubel Forsey. You don't hear a whole lot about Robert. Stephen Forsey's the front man. He does all of the press. I've interviewed him several times, and he's a boisterous, loud, gregarious, fun-loving Englishman. And Robert Greubel, who's French, is super quiet. Now, Stephen's more on the technical side. Robert's more on the aesthetic side of the watch production. The Double Tourbillon Secret was his idea, to have the Double Tourbillon 30 degree, but with a solid dial. So if you didn't want all of the action on the dial side, there was an option for you. It's still big. There's no doubt about that. It's 43.5 millimeters. It's still very prominent. But if you want, I don't want to call it modesty, but maybe just respect for history, when a tourbillon was never traditionally something to be seen, but something to be cherished for its intrinsic qualities, this watch gets me in touch with that kind of mentality. It's a throwback to a day back when Patek Philippe would take chronometry trials tourbillons and case them up in whatever case happened to be available with a solid dial, put a serial number on the dial to let you know this was a tourbillon and a special one, and then just leave it at that. And I feel like this watch channels that era of Patek back in the 80s when they were just taking old chronometry tourbillon calibers, sticking them in cases, and selling them for a song to any collector who was interested. This is in that tradition and really cool. There is a DLC version of this in black platinum, which almost inverts the idea of the subtlety, but it is, I have to admit, the coolest looking version of it. And it would almost certainly hit our target price of $500,000. The version of this watch most commonly seen is with a silver white dial, which I think is fine. In white gold, that's cool, but it's a little bit, I don't know, it's a little bit of a softer look. I'd be happy with either one, because this is a real chronometry-driven tourbillon. The double tourbillon secret, I believe, is mechanically identical in every way to the double tourbillon 30 degree, which at the Concours de Chronométrie actually won with the highest number of points of any watch ever entered in the competition. So it's a real tourbillon. It's not just for aesthetics. It's not eye candy, though it is that too. And the secret would be my version of it, although if I got to be honest, that black DLC platinum, so ridiculous to cover up platinum, but I love the contradiction of it. Covering the platinum and covering the tourbillon.
Just the heft of that watch alone, like you would think it was made out of, I don't, like a dark tantalum or something with the way how hefty platinum is. And it's, I can only assume, I've never seen one of these in person. I can only assume that the glow permeates the DLC to a certain degree. Or rather, the finish of the platinum.
Whatever the finish of the platinum is, the DLC will accentuate it. Now, I've seen black platinum before, but I've only seen it from 3 brands: Urwerk, Zenith, and then Greubel Forsey, and always in very limited applications. Paradoxically, these blackened platinum watches are always saved as very, very special pieces. So that's an interesting piece, and one even I haven't seen. I've never physically come in contact with the double tourbillon secret, and certainly not the DLC model. What's your second 500,000 class watch?
So this took me a long time because I had a lot of delusions of grandeur of picking a minute repeater or something of the like. And, you know, at a certain point, I think I'm a blunt instrument, Tim, and I think a brass movement first series FP Journe Resonance with a gold dial in platinum really, really, really pings that meter for me. And, you know, I'll take it a step further and say on a bracelet. There's just something about resonance that's just special to me. That's just more interesting than almost any other watch you put next to it. And I can't get past that. I think it's the fanboy in me really hitting hard, but I just love first series resonance.
That is a great piece. And that's one of the few watches whose historical hype to me seems about proportional to its actual significance. That was an incredible achievement and an innovation by Journe. And I'm no Journe fanboy, so when I say that watch was an incredible achievement, I mean I genuinely admire it. Doing something that no one had yet done in a wristwatch format, 2 resonating parallel movements with no physical coupling, self-correcting to a chronometer level of accuracy, and it's a dual time to boot. And it's a pioneering piece. It's not just one of the core Journe watches. I think if you're going to buy a core Journe watch, you're going to get yourself the Tourbillon with Remontoire, or you're going to get yourself the Resonance. And this is where the Resonance started. This is so cool because it's almost like magic. There's a physics that makes sense behind it, the resonation of the two. The resonance of the two and the way they couple over about 7 to 10 minutes after continuous operation, it's all math. But I think the best thing in mechanical watchmaking is that it does feel, whether it's just a pocket watch that you wind and admire as it starts up, or something like this that's a sort of sight unseen magic hand guiding your watch. It's the magic of a mechanical movement that really appeals to us, and I think this is one of the most magical.
The nature of the invisible force that is resonance is extremely interesting. I think, you know, the fact that the Breguet in a clock was able to create this phenomena in the late 1700s, early 1800s.
It's best known, it's best known as a phenomenon pioneered in pendulum clocks by a clockmaker named Antide Janvier, and Journe loved Janvier's work so much that once he made a little bit of money with his eponymous brand, he went out and bought one of the clocks. And I was allowed to beat up a Grande Sonnerie when I was at F.P. Journe's atelier, and they didn't care. They said, nobody touches or winds this clock except Francois Paul. So a little sense of just how special that clock was to him, that only he is allowed to wind it. It's just a really cool idea, and it gives you sort of a window into the mind of the man where you can actually sort of see what he really values, and you can infer what this watch meant to him. And I'll add this. When Armand Strom launched the Mirrored Force Resonance in 2015, Journe was beside himself with anger over this.
I have strong feelings about that watch. I really, really do, because, Tim, it's not a resonance.
No, it's not. The hairsprings are coupled together. There's a mechanical link between the two hairsprings.
And you can see it. They showcase it. They showcase it as part of the innovation, quote unquote. And again, I'm not trying to be hard on it because I do think it is a cool watch, but it is not a resonance.
No, it's not. And it looks cooler than Journe's system because you've got this pulsing spring, but it's also cheating. You may as well gear them together. You might as well, do something like what Rudy Silva did with the two balances geared together. Then they're guaranteed to move at the same speed. But yeah, and I think Journe had every right to be a little bit pissed off by that. So I took that as a good sign if you're an owner of the Resonance watch, because it shows once again how much passion he has for that model, that he would defend it so fiercely in an otherwise unrelated dinner over fish. Okay.
What is your second pick in the 500K range?
So back in 2016, when Govberg first bought Watch You Want, I encountered what I continue to believe is the greatest watch ever made. Built from about 1993 to 2010, the Patek Philippe 5016, which is retrograde perpetual calendar, minute repeater, and tourbillon. And it shows none of its hands. It's 36 millimeters in diameter. The tourbillon is on the case back. The minute repeater is always a subtle thing. Unless you notice the slide, it's not going to declare itself. Every 5016 is the ultimate 5016. I don't care. It's gorgeous. That crazy third wheel that looks almost like an octopus, but it can't be because I think it's got 5 spokes. That stupid wheel takes 9 to 10 hours to finish by hand, and it's made of 14-karat mechanical grade gold. You've got black polish. You've got interior angles. You've got the Patek Philippe of your dreams. It's like you meet your hero, and he's taller, more handsome, and dashing than you ever imagined. Not disappointed in any way, but maybe overawed to an even greater extent. And on my little wrist, this 36-millimeter giant is perfect. There's a 5316 that's great, but the 5016, it was not just the perfect watch, full of complications and total discretion and beautiful packaging to fit all this in a 36-millimeter case. There's something about this watch where no matter how you configure it, yellow gold, rose gold, white gold, platinum, light dial, silver dial, black dial, blue dial, it is just bewilderingly gorgeous. And when the steel one went at Only Watch in 2015, I didn't even think well, that's the one to own. I'm not a rose gold guy. I wore one of these with a rose gold dial or rose gold case and a black dial. I was sold. I was like, done. Take my kidneys, both of them. I'll live for a few hours and treasure every minute. But then I found the 2 kidneys are not worth as much as this watch, which left me despondent. So if you want to buy one of these, I think depending on the metal, you're going to wind up spending somewhere between $700,000 and $1 million to get one. Now, 200 pieces made from 93 to 2010 should say something about the kind of Patek Philippe watchmaker who is set aside for this kind of a project. Not every person at Patek can make this, and it's going to be slow going. And you're going to look at most 10 to 12 pieces a year.
There's so much going on in this. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, that third wheel is based off of the one of the wheels on a rose lathe, correct?
Yes.
Yes, and I love that little detail. I love that. I love the size of the tourbillon. I love the architecture of the tourbillon bridge. I love the Calatrava cross cap on the centrifugal governor. I love everything that 5016 has to offer, and it is everything that Patek has done, does today, and will do under one crystal, under one case, and it just does it so much better than anything else. It is a true grail among grails, and I think I mean, of course, the dark dial guy myself, black dial platinum case is the one to have.
And think about this in value terms. Now, if you're going to go out and you're going to buy a 5316 today with the same movement, you're going to spend between $1 million, and if you're getting the sapphire dial, you're going to spend between $1 million and $2.2 million. Whereas if you go out and you pick yourself up a platinum 5016, you're going to pay under $1 million for that watch. So think about white gold, think about yellow gold, think about rose gold. I wore this watch in yellow gold with a black dial. Sold. Done. Nothing left to desire. So guys, let us know. Reach out to podcasts@the1916company.com and tell us what topics you'd like us to pursue and what questions you would like us to answer. Until then, Armand, how do people reach out to us if they want to buy a watch or just chat?
You can find me on Instagram at It's Me Armand, or email at armand@the1916company.com.
And I am Tim_Masso on Instagram. Time out.